Now, the British government has reportedly received advice from its own lawyers that Israel has breached international humanitarian law in Gaza, but it has failed to disclose this publicly. For more on this, let's speak to Geoffrey Nice, who's a human rights lawyer who prosecuted former Serbian leader Slobodan Milošević and is joining us from Canterbury. Thank you very much for your time. So, the lawyers of the British government themselves, according to this report, have told it that Israel is breaking international law, but they haven't made this public. Are you surprised at all, first of all, by this revelation?
First of all, I'm not at all surprised that the government would seek advice from its lawyers. It would have to do so as soon as it became public that many commentators, but more important, many people in authority in the United Nations were concerned about Israel's military attack not being proportionate. Proportionality is what's required for an attack to be lawful. So they were bound to seek legal advice. Given the weight of opinion,
the fact that they've ignored, it would seem, this advice, is that surprising? Is that unusual?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The fact that they received this advice from their own lawyers, but it would seem have chosen to ignore it, is that unusual? Is that surprising?
We don't know that yet. I have not seen the advice. This is a report which refers to an account of the advice. Let us assume, first of all, there would be an advice. Would the advice deal with the question of proportionality and lawfulness of the attack? Yes, it would. Is the advice likely to have found that there could be or was lack of proportionality and therefore criminality? It certainly could have reached that conclusion, given the majority opinion among those, not me, but people close to the war and with real authority from the United Nations and elsewhere. It would be unsurprising if the advice gave that conclusion. If the advice did give that conclusion, and if the government acted without regard to that advice, that would be very concerning, not just to those who are lawyers acting in an international environment, but it would be very concerning to the public. The public's interest in this war has been very substantially aroused. Emotions, not that emotions are very valuable, but emotions are pretty high. And the public would like to know, and I would say is entitled to know, what the advice said, this way or that way.
Right. So concerning, you say, what about the legal implications of this? By continuing to sell arms to Israel, is the British government complicit in the crimes that are being committed? And you know, if it is the case, could there also be then a case against the British government at an international court?
Yeah. If any government has received clear advice, what's happening by the combatant party is unlawful, then in providing weapons for an unlawful activity, it runs the risk of being found to be complicit. Might it get round that risk by saying, oh, well, you can have these weapons, but you can only use them in certain circumstances? Difficult. And we understand from the latest alleged provision of arms by America, it's not using that get-out clause. So, yes, there is a real risk that a government providing arms to a party engaged in unlawful warfare could find itself complicit. And that's not very surprising. If you know your neighbor is about to commit a crime and wants a gun and you hand them the gun, well, of course, you're guilty with the neighbor. You can't get out of it. So it's a big problem for governments.
Right.
And I think, go on.
Go on, please. Finish your thought, and then I'll ask you the next question.
Well, I think what's going to be interesting is to see whether these sorts of concerns are going to be resolved by publishing the advice received by governments, not just our government, America and all other governments involved in provision of arms. And who knows, the advice may solve the problem. But if it doesn't solve the problem, or if the advice is not published, what's going to be the next step when, as one is bound to hope, the whole matter is eventually laid before an international court of some kind to deal with criminality of both sides, Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force, which is what the public at large would want? Well, you may find that governments, the big powerful governments, will try and stop those legal proceedings. There's a lot to play for here.
Right. And presumably, Mr. Nice, if British lawyers are making these conclusions, other lawyers in other countries must also have had the same advice probably to their governments. You talked about possible legal proceedings at the international level. What about at the national level? Could they be cases at the national level against the UK, for example?
Well, there might be, I suppose, but that's a bit of a stretch because you've got to have an appropriate jurisdiction that can deal with the government, which is not that easy, whereas the International Criminal Court, for example, can bring in individuals who are responsible, and maybe the International Court of Justice can look, if genocide is alleged and shown in any way, at governments. But I think what's really interesting and important overall is that all countries, developed countries, will have obtained advice from their lawyers about the legality of what's happening in Israel if their governments are involved on either side in the provision of arms to one side or the other. It's pretty clear that Hamas's use of arms has been unlawful because they've been firing unarmed rockets at civilian areas, something very difficult to justify, and they've also been engaged in the horrifying, along with maybe other groups. Say yes, no. Let me just finish. On the 7th of October, so governments on either side will have, who are possibly involved, will have obtained legal advice, and in all cases, we, the public, you and I, the world citizen, need to know what the advice has been.
Geoffrey Nice, thank you very much for talking to us. As always, very good to get your insight. Geoffrey Nice is a human rights lawyer joining us there from Canterbury.